December 1964. Deep in the Mekong Delta, the night was so black it felt alive. Thick, wet, and suffocating, swallowing even the glow of the distant river. For the Viet Cong company commander crouched beneath the palm fronds, this darkness was home. It was his greatest ally. American patrols feared it. ARVN posts dreaded it. But to him, the night was a shield, a familiar curtain behind which victory lived. Tonight's target was a remote Special Forces camp, a cluster of sandbags and wooden towers barely clinging to a clearing. Through the tangled brush, he watched his men settle into their assault positions. Mortar crews adjusted their tubes. Sappers tightened the fuses on satchel charges. A machine gunner whispered a joke about the Americans trembling inside their bunkers. Confidence shimmered through the tree line like heat. Then the sound came. Slow, droning, harmless. A C-47. The same old transport the guerrillas had seen for years. Dropping rice to mountain tribes, hauling cargo, drifting across the sky like an elderly water buffalo. Some of the younger fighters didn't even look up. To them, the slow-moving aircraft was irrelevant, a relic of another war. A flare popped overhead, turning the clearing white as bone. The VC commander smirked. More flares. More toys from Saigon and Washington. His men grit their teeth at the burst of light, but stayed calm. They had rehearsed through worse. The Americans would drop a few flares, fire blindly into the tree line, then wait for reinforcements that would never arrive in time. The C-47 circled again, slow and lazy, as if the pilot were admiring the scenery. Another flare dropped. Then, from the belly of the night, came a sound none of them had ever heard. A rising metallic shriek. Wheer! One of the sappers flinched. "What is that?" The commander opened his mouth to answer. But suddenly the sky tore open. A river of red tracers poured downward in a perfect, unbroken sheet. 3 GE miniguns fired so fast the rounds looked like solid beams, stitching the jungle floor, chewing through palm trunks, ripping the darkness apart. Men screamed and dove into the earth. Mortar tubes flipped. Branches exploded into splinters. The commander felt the air itself vibrating as bullets pummeled every leaf, every root, every inch of the tree line. There was no direction to run. Only impact after impact after impact. A fighter beside him shouted, "It's a dragon! A dragon in the sky!" The commander pressed his face into the mud as the miniguns swept past, and he realized, with sudden terror, that the old, harmless, lumbering C-47 was gone. Something else circled above them now. Something built for the night. Something built for killing. When darkness stopped belonging to the guerrillas, for 3 years of war, the Viet Cong had ruled the night. Darkness was their camouflage, their concealment, their greatest strategic weapon. Under moonless skies, they slipped past wire, overran outposts, ambushed convoys, and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. American advisors understood the pattern all too well. If the sun went down, the enemy grew stronger. But starting in late 1964, strange reports began filtering through the Mekong Delta and the Central Highlands, stories of night assaults suddenly collapsing, of entire VC platoons shredded in seconds, of a demon plane that turned the jungle into daylight and the ground into burning shrapnel. At first, many commanders dismissed these accounts as exaggerations from terrified militiamen. How could a transport aircraft, a World War II relic, change the arithmetic of the night war? Yet the truth was undeniable. The AC-47 gunship, spooky Puff the Magic Dragon, the Dragon Ship, was not just another aircraft. It was a new category of weapon. A machine that combined relentless firepower, persistent presence, and eerie accuracy into something Vietnam had never seen before. It did not attack briefly and disappear. It circled above you, watched you, illuminated you, and erased you. This is the story of how the Viet Cong's most reliable advantage, The cover of darkness was stolen by a slow, outdated transport plane reborn as a flying scythe. A story of how mockery turned to dread, how the night itself changed sides, and how the AC-47's miniguns rewrote the rules of the Vietnam War. From flare ship to flying scythe, long before the Viet Cong learned to fear the red rivers of fire pouring from the night sky, the idea of a side-firing gunship lived only in the imagination of one man, Captain Ron Terry of the United States Air Force. In early 1964, Terry returned from South Vietnam deeply troubled. He had seen Special Forces camps overrun in the dead of night, watched fast-moving jets streak overhead too quickly to pick out targets, and witnessed artillery fall short or scatter helplessly into the jungle. What he realized was brutally simple. America had no weapon that could stay above a battlefield and deliver continuous, precise fire in the dark. Terry obsessed over this problem. He replayed night assaults in his mind. He spoke with exhausted Green Berets who had survived only because a flare ship happened to wander close enough to scare off attackers. He studied the limitations of jet fighters: too fast, too high, too fleeting. And gradually a new idea formed. What if the flare ship didn't just illuminate the battlefield? What if it became the weapon? Back in the States, Terry dug into old research projects, including a little-remembered experiment called Project Tail Chaser, where an antiquated airplane had been fitted with a single machine gun firing out the side. The results were startling. In a tight circle, the bullets landed consistently within a confined patch of ground, proof that a circling aircraft could deliver astonishing accuracy. Terry proposed something radical. Take the dependable C-47 transport, slow, stable, roomy, and mount 3 GE 7.6 2mm miniguns firing from the left side. The aircraft would bank in a wide, steady orbit, turning the miniguns into a continuous sweep of fire. A flying machine gun nest, a skybound artillery battery, a weapon that could stay overhead for hours. Higher-ups were skeptical. A transport plane against guerrillas who moved like ghosts? But desperation swayed them. Camps were falling. Night after night, the VC proved that speed and stealth beat bureaucracy. So in December 1964, at Bien Hoa Air Base, Terry and a tiny team got their hands on 2 aging C-47s. Inside their dimly lit fuselages, technicians bolted miniguns to makeshift mounts, fed them with massive drums of ammunition, and linked them to a crude gun sight taped to the pilot's window. They worked for days without pause, transforming the familiar Goonie bird into a creature the world had never seen. When the first test firing lit up the night, 3 streams of molten red tracers painting perfect arcs across the ground, everyone on the flight line felt the same chill. The era of the gunship had begun. The AC-47's baptism by fire came almost immediately. On the night of December 23, 1964, deep in the Mekong Delta, a small outpost at Tran Yen was being torn apart. Mortars thudded inside the wire, sappers crawled through blown gaps in the perimeter. Radio transmissions from the besieged camp were panicked, tangled, and fading fast. The Americans at Bien Hoa had almost nothing to send. Almost nothing except Ron Terry's experimental gunship. The newly christened FC-47, still bearing the faded paint of its transport days, lumbered into the sky with a skeleton crew and more ammunition than any aircraft of its type had ever carried. As they neared the camp, the pilots could see the tracers from VC machine guns lashing upward, arcing toward the base like angry fireflies. "Looks bad down there," the flight engineer muttered. The pilot banked left. The world outside the cargo door tilted. The minigunners braced themselves. And then, in a single motion, the Dragon breathed. Red streams poured from the sky, forming a shimmering curtain of fire that swept across the tree line. The camp lit up in ghostly illumination as flares popped overhead. Every few seconds, the pilot adjusted his orbit, walking the guns along the VC's assault routes. The defenders watched in disbelief as entire sections of jungle erupted under the Torrent. Within minutes, the attack collapsed. Survivors later described the gunship's arrival as if the sky itself had started shooting. Some claimed the tracers looked like ropes of glowing beads. Others swore the noise wasn't mechanical at all, but the growl of some monstrous thing circling just beyond the light. But the night was not finished. No sooner had the FC-47 broken the siege at Tran Yen than a second emergency call came in from Trung Hung, 20 miles away. Another camp under attack, ammunition nearly gone, defenders down to knives and desperation. Without hesitation, the gunship roared back into the black sky. When it arrived, the VC were massing for their final rush. The miniguns ignited again, sweeping trenches, ditches, and approach lanes in meticulously controlled arcs. The assault disintegrated. By dawn, both camps still stood, shaken, cratered, but alive. Between December 15th and 26th, the prototypes flew 16 combat sorties. 16 camps were saved. 16 times, the Viet Cong learned the same terrifying lesson. The night no longer belonged to them. From the outside, the AC-47 didn't look like a weapon that could change a war. It looked like history. A 1930s transport plane with wrinkled aluminum skin, round engines from another era, and a shape so familiar that both Americans and Vietnamese recognized it instantly as the old C-47 Skytrain, the same aircraft that had dropped paratroopers into Normandy and hauled wounded men out of Pacific jungles. No one expected fear from a machine like that. But inside was something entirely different. Walk through the narrow doorway, and the cargo bay no longer held crates or passengers. Instead, it bristled with 3 GE 7.6 2mm miniguns, each one a 6-barreled mechanical cyclone capable of firing up to 100 rounds per second. The guns were bolted to reinforced mounts along the port side, angled downward so their streams would converge precisely on the ground whenever the aircraft banked in its signature left-hand orbit. Ammunition dominated everything. Belts of 7.62 2mm rounds hung everywhere, coiling across the floor, draped over racks, feeding into massive drums secured to the fuselage. On a typical mission, the crew loaded tens of thousands of rounds, enough weight to make the aircraft groan as it taxied. The moment the guns opened up, the floor vibrated with a constant metallic roar, brass casings bouncing and rolling like marbles in a storm. The cockpit was equally transformed. A crude but effective grease pencil gun sight marked the pilot's window, allowing him to keep the target locked dead center during the pylon turn. Instruments glowed red in the dark. The navigator and flight engineer communicated in clipped, practiced bursts, checking ammo flow, monitoring engine temperatures, adjusting orbit altitude by the foot. What made the AC-47 truly fearsome wasn't its speed or armor. It was its patience. While jets flashed overhead for seconds, Spooky could circle a battlefield for hours, holding a perfect firing pattern, illuminating the jungle with flares, and laying down streams of fire so thick they looked solid. A single AC-47 could suppress an area larger than a football field and keep it suppressed indefinitely. It was a relic on the outside, yes. But inside, it was a machine built for one purpose: to own the night. In the early months of the gunship's existence, the Viet Cong did not fear the AC-47. In truth, they barely noticed it. To most guerrilla units scattered across the Delta, the old C-47 was just another background noise of the war. A slow, lumbering con chim ja, the old bird, flapping lazily across the sky. It dropped leaflets. It dropped rice. Sometimes it dropped flares that hung uselessly over empty roads, while the real fighting took place miles away in the jungle, hardly a threat. Among frontline VC, the aircraft became a target of jokes. Fighters waved at it from tree lines. Machine gunners laughed that it flew so slowly you could walk faster than its shadow. Political officers briefed new recruits with casual dismissal. Save your ammunition for helicopters and jets. This old American buffalo is not worth a bullet. At night, when they heard the distant hum of radial engines, guerrillas rarely bothered to take cover. The noise belonged to transports or reconnaissance flights, neither of which could stop a determined assault. The VC carried Soviet PPSH submachine guns and Chinese heavy machine guns designed to cut apart helicopters. The idea that a transport plane could threaten them felt absurd. Even North Vietnamese intelligence officers initially brushed off reports from the South. Their dossiers described the C-47 as a slow, vulnerable support aircraft with no meaningful offensive capability. One senior cadre reportedly scoffed, "If the Americans must use museum planes, they are more desperate than we believed." That confidence filtered down into every platoon, every sapper team, every mortar squad preparing a night attack. They believed the old Goonie bird was a joke, a harmless antique, an animal too slow and too stupid to be dangerous. What they did not know, what they couldn't know, was that inside that familiar silhouette, a new weapon waited. A weapon that would erase entire assault waves in seconds. A weapon that would turn jokes into nightmares. To understand why the AC-47 shattered Viet Cong confidence so violently, you have to picture what its fire looked like. Not in technical diagrams, but the way a guerrilla on the ground experienced it. Imagine standing in a dark jungle clearing. The air is humid, the sky starless. The only sounds the quiet clicks of your squad, preparing for an assault. Then a flare erupts overhead, turning night into a pale white blur. For a split second, you see everything. Your comrades, the tree line, the wire of the American outpost ahead. And then you hear it, a rising mechanical scream from above. The miniguns are spooling up. Unlike conventional aircraft guns, which fire in short, choppy bursts, the minigun spits out bullets so quickly that the eye blends them into a solid, unbroken beam of red light. Each gun fires up to 6,000 rounds per minute, meaning that Spooky's 3-gun broadside can unleash 100 rounds per second, aimed with machine-like stability into the same patch of earth. The result is not a stream of bullets. It is a sheet of bullets. From its left-hand orbit, about 3,000 feet up, slipping through the night at 120 knots, the AC-47 can pour fire into an area the size of a football field with such density that statistically every square yard will be struck within seconds. Grass folds, tree trunks splinter, dirt erupts into fountains. Any human caught in that zone faces the equivalent of a sustained machine gun platoon firing exclusively at them. And there is no pause, no reload break, no moment of silence to catch breath or escape. The circling aircraft keeps its guns locked on target continuously. While a ground gunner would need to adjust his aim, fight recoil, or duck return fire, Spooky simply banks and keeps firing, each round tracing the same glowing arc as the one before it. For the Viet Cong, it was unlike anything they had ever faced. They could handle mortars, unpredictable but intermittent. They could handle jets, terrifying but fleeting. They could handle helicopters, dangerous but vulnerable. But they had never faced a weapon that could fire without end. Guerrillas later said it felt like the jungle itself turned hostile, as if the night had betrayed them. One VC survivor recalled crouching behind a termite mound while bullets shaved its surface into powder. "There was no place to hide," he said. "Even the earth was not enough." When the AC-47 first arrived in Vietnam, it was little more than an experiment with teeth, a clever idea strapped to an old cargo plane. But within weeks of its debut, a new system of night warfare began to form, one that would fundamentally reshape how outposts survived Viet Cong assaults. The key was coordination. On the ground, U.S. Special Forces and ARVN defenders learned quickly that Spooky was most effective when guided, not simply unleashed. Camps began preparing pre-planned fire zones, tree lines, canal banks, dry creek beds, mapped out by compass bearings and marked with code names. When the attack came, defenders radioed Spooky with simple, clipped commands. Dragon ship, engage Red Sparrow. Shift fire to Bamboo 1. Walk the line east, danger close. Because the gunship fired in a stable orbit, even tiny adjustments in the pilot's bank angle could redirect the torrent of bullets with eerie precision. For the first time, villages and outposts under siege had a guardian that could thread fire meters from friendly lines without hitting them. As the months passed, a doctrine emerged. Marker rounds. Friendly troops fired tracers into the tree line to designate VC positions. Flares and counter-flares, spooky dropped illumination, while ground forces used their own to signal shifts or cancellations. Dual ship operations. One AC-47 lit the battlefield. The second poured fire into the target area. Continuous orbits. At high-threat camps, a spooky remained in the area all night, circling lazily, waiting for trouble. American advisors began to notice something extraordinary. VC assaults slowed the moment the gunship's engines were heard. Guerrillas who once charged boldly now paused, scattered, or attempted to crawl instead of rush. On the radio nets of Delta outposts, a new phrase became common: "Hold the line. Spooky is coming." For many defenders, this wasn't just reassurance, it was survival. And for the Viet Cong, it meant the battlefield had changed. The jungle no longer guaranteed concealment. The darkness no longer guaranteed surprise. And massed nighttime assaults, once their signature tactic, had suddenly become a fatal gamble. The battle for Bong Son, February 8, 1965, became the moment the Viet Cong learned, beyond rumor, beyond fear, that the AC-47 Spooky was not just another American trick. It was a force of nature. The engagement began just after dusk, when darkness rolled across the rice paddies like a living tide. An ARVN outpost, perched on a low ridge, reported movement. First whispers, then shadows, then the distinct rustle of hundreds of men shifting into attack formation. Intelligence later confirmed it. A reinforced VC battalion, nearly 500 fighters, tightening its noose for a classic nighttime overrun. By 2030, mortars began falling. The first arcs of fire smashed into outer bunkers, sending debris spraying across defensive lines. Radio operators inside the command hut shouted for support, their voices competing with the concussive thumps of explosions. The outpost had hours at most, but help was already in the air. Spooky 10, an FC-47 gunship on routine night patrol, diverted immediately. Inside the aircraft, crewmen stacked ammo belts like coiled snakes along the fuselage. Red interior lights glowed faintly against metal walls scuffed by years of transport duty. The pilot throttled forward, engines rumbling as they pushed through low clouds toward the faint flashes of the battle. When they arrived, the battlefield below was chaotic. Muzzle flashes, streaking tracers, exploding flares, and the unmistakable shadows of advancing VC squads weaving through the paddies. The pilot banked left. The minigunner steadied his grip. The navigator read out bearings. Then the guns opened. The first burst swept an entire paddy dike, tearing it apart like wet paper. VC fighters caught in the open were flung into the air by the impact. Others scattered desperately, diving into irrigation trenches, hugging the ground, crawling through mud black as ink. But the miniguns didn't care. They didn't aim for individuals. They erased areas. The VC shifted tactics. They spread their assault columns, hoping to dilute the gunship's power. Spooky shifted with them, walking tracer fire in smooth, rhythmic passes, each beam slicing the battlefield like a glowing scalpel. For 4 hours, the gunship remained overhead. 4 hours of constant circling. 4 hours of flares drifting down like burning snow. 4 hours of miniguns spitting 20,000 rounds into the assault waves. Inside the aircraft, the temperature rose. Brass casings piled ankle deep. The loaders' gloves smoked from friction as they shoved belt after belt into the hungry guns. The pilot fought fatigue, muscles stiff from holding the same orbit, sweat dripping down the side of his oxygen mask. Yet the rhythm never broke. Below, the VC attack unraveled. Squads vanished. Commanders lost cohesion. Entire elements melted back into the jungle, leaving fields littered with torn earth and shattered equipment. At dawn, the ARVN defenders staggered out of their positions. Many were dehydrated, concussed, or half-blind from the night's explosions, but alive. They looked at the destruction around them and understood what had saved them. A slow, old, gentle-looking airplane had done this. A flying relic had held back an army. The stunning success of the AC-47 prototypes spread through the U.S. military like wildfire. Reports from Special Forces camps described impossible rescues, broken assaults, and entire VC units annihilated by a single circling aircraft. Commanders who had once dismissed Captain Ron Terry's idea as a quirky improvisation now sent urgent cables to Saigon and Washington. We need more dragons. By mid-1965, the U.S. Air Force could no longer treat the gunship as an experiment. A formal unit was created, the 4th Air Commando Squadron, dedicated exclusively to night operations with the new AC-47s. Maintenance crews rushed to convert additional C-47's transports, stripping interiors, reinforcing mounts, and installing the now iconic trio of miniguns. Workshops across Vietnam buzzed with activity as aircraft were transformed from cargo haulers into flying batteries. Within months, Spookies took up permanent night orbits across multiple regions of South Vietnam. Delta outposts learned their schedules by heart. Some soldiers even claimed they could sleep soundly only once they heard that familiar radial drone circling above. The presence of a gunship didn't just provide firepower, it restored morale. Night after night, crews rehearsed tactics. Standard 3,000-foot orbit. Tight enough for precision, high enough to avoid most small arms. Flare sequencing, coordinated drops to maintain unbroken illumination. Ammunition discipline, short bursts for probing, long sweeps for breaking assaults. Danger close firing, sometimes within 50 meters of friendly lines, requiring total trust between pilot and ground controller. As more aircraft joined the fleet, Spookies began flying in pairs, one illuminating, the other firing. Outposts under threat could expect help not in an hour, but in minutes. The mere rumor of a gunship overhead sometimes caused VC units to delay or cancel planned assaults. For the first time in the war, American and ARVN defenders felt that the night no longer guaranteed defeat. Something watched over them, slow, patient, and impossibly deadly. The Goonie bird had become a guardian, and the Viet Cong realized they now faced an enemy that never slept. No weapon, no matter how terrifying, remains unchallenged for long. After the shock of early encounters, the Viet Cong began a methodical effort to adapt to the AC-47. Their commanders were disciplined, experienced, and intimately familiar with the unforgiving arithmetic of guerrilla warfare. If Spooky owned the sky, they would simply learn to fight beneath it. The stunning success of the AC-47 prototypes spread through the U.S. military like wildfire. Reports from Special Forces camps described impossible rescues, broken assaults, and entire VC units annihilated by a single circling aircraft. Commanders who had once dismissed Captain Ron Terry's idea as a quirky improvisation now sent urgent cables to Saigon and Washington. The first adjustment was dispersion. Where once VC battalions moved in dense, confident packs, they now spread into thin, scattered assault lines. A company that previously advanced shoulder to shoulder might now crawl forward in fire teams spaced dozens of meters apart. This didn't eliminate losses, but it prevented entire units from being erased in a single burst of minigun fire. Next came the earth itself. The VC dug deeper, trenches, spider holes, bunkers roofed with layered logs and damp soil. Some positions were so low and narrow that fighters had to slide in headfirst, lying prone in suffocating blackness, while the gunship passed overhead like a roaring storm. These shelters often saved lives, but at a cost. Men could not move, coordinate, or attack while hiding. The initiative, once their greatest strength, began slipping away. Then came the weather game. Gunships needed steady air and visibility. The VC did not. They began timing assaults during heavy rain or fog, when flares were smothered and minigun accuracy suffered. Storms became their allies. Natural camouflage against the mechanical dragon above. VC cadres also instituted strict tactical rules. Never mass within artillery and gunship range. Attack only when movement is concealed by weather or darkness. Freeze completely when illumination flares ignite. Motion meant death. Withdraw the moment Spooky's engines were heard. Live to attack another night. Some guerrillas even developed what Americans later called puff avoidance drills. Units practiced diving to the ground, rolling into depressions, or using irrigation dikes as instant cover at the first sign of flares. These adaptations blunted Spooky's fury, but they did not stop it. Every adjustment the VC made came with a price: slower movement, disrupted attacks, shattered momentum, and the constant, grinding fear of the sky. For the first time in the war, the guerrillas felt hunted at night. The siege began just after sunset, when the humidity wrapped itself around the small Montagnard hamlet like a wet blanket. The village, nothing more than a scatter of thatched huts, a dirt road, and a dozen defensive berms, was guarded by a mix of CIDG militiamen and a handful of exhausted U.S. Special Forces advisors. They had fought off 2 probes earlier in the afternoon. Now the real attack was coming. From the tree line, the Viet Cong crept forward in silence. Claymore mines planted by the defenders popped one after another, flashing white in the darkness. The first mortar shells slammed into the perimeter, blasting craters into the soft earth and shredding bamboo fences. Children huddled in bunkers, dug beneath their homes, clutching their ears as each explosion shook the ground. Inside the command hut, the radio operator yelled above the noise, "They're in the outer wire! We need Spooky now!" Miles away, in the thick black sky, Spooky 21 was already lining up for approach. The crew heard the desperation in the voices below. They had responded to enough of these calls to know when a village stood minutes away from annihilation. The pilot pushed the throttles forward. Flares were readied, miniguns armed. Back on the ground, VC sappers were cutting through the inner fence. The defenders fired blindly into the darkness. One advisor sprinted across the compound to rally the southern flank, when a mortar blast knocked him off his feet. Dust filled the air. Shouting blurred with screams and the rattle of AK-47s. The defenders had minutes at best. Then the night changed. A soft hum drifted overhead, at first barely noticeable, then louder, then unmistakable. The villagers lifted their heads. The defenders paused. Even the Viet Cong hesitated, sensing the air shift, as if a storm were building. The first flare burst above the hamlet, bathing the battlefield in ghostly white light. Spooky had arrived. From the left side of the circling aircraft, 3 miniguns unleashed a roar like a tearing metal storm. Tracer lines swept the tree line, walking in perfect arcs, not more than 30 meters from the friendly perimeter. The ground erupted as if a giant invisible comb were raking the jungle. Inside the hamlet, a young Montagnard girl peeked from a bunker slit and saw something she would remember for the rest of her life. Red lines falling from the sky, thousands of them, tracing patterns through the darkness, lighting the night like fiery rain. Her father, trembling and covered in dust, whispered, "The big ghost is here!" Outside, Viet Cong fighters scattered, some running, others crawling frantically into ditches. One sapper, crouched behind a tree stump, watched it disintegrate under a burst of minigun fire. Another fighter clutched his ears as the sound vibrated through his body. He later told interrogators it felt like the air itself was shredding. For nearly 30 minutes, Spooky circled, firing in controlled sweeps, every burst pushing the VC farther back, every pass saving another meter of the village. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the assault broke. The treeline fell silent. The dragon ship banked away, its mission done. When the defenders emerged into the smoke-filled dawn, they found bodies and weapons scattered along the outer fields. But the village still stood. The wounded were treated, the children comforted, and the advisors exhaustedly leaned against sandbags, knowing exactly what had saved them. Not walls, not numbers, not luck. A slow, steady, watchful guardian circling in the night sky. By late 1966, the AC-47 had already become a legend, spoken of with awe in American outposts, with gratitude in ARVN units, and with dread in Viet Cong whispers. But even legends have limits. The old Goonie bird was tough, dependable, and terrifying when its guns were running. But it was still a product of the 1930s, slow, lightly armored, and increasingly vulnerable to the growing number of heavy machine guns and anti-aircraft weapons entering the conflict. The Air Force recognized something crucial. The concept worked brilliantly. Now they needed an airframe that could carry it into the future. Thus began the evolution from Spooky to Spectre. The first step came with the AC-119G and AC-119K gunships, built from converted Fairchild transports. Larger, stronger, and more modern than the C-47, these aircraft could carry heavier weapons, improved sensors, and, most importantly, armor plating to survive the rising threat of ground fire. The AC-119K variant even mounted two 20mm cannons alongside the miniguns, giving it far greater punch against fortified positions and trucks on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But the true successor, the aircraft that would define American night warfare for generations, was born from a far more powerful platform, the C-130 Hercules. In 1968, the first AC-130A Spectre arrived in theater. It was everything Spooky dreamed of becoming: faster, higher flying, better protected, and equipped with an arsenal that dwarfed its predecessor. Miniguns, 20mm Vulcans, 40mm Bofors cannons, and eventually even a direct-fire 105mm howitzer. Add in infrared sensors, night vision scopes, and sophisticated tracking systems, and the AC-130 became a night predator with few equals. Yet despite all this advancement, crews never forgot where the lineage began. Every briefing, every mission, every orbit owed itself to the humble AC-47. The airplane that proved a circling gunship could rewrite the rules of war. Spooky had shown what was possible. Spectre would refine it into dominance. Behind every dramatic rescue, every jungle torn apart by red tracers, every outpost saved in the dead of night, there was a vast and unseen machine keeping the AC-47 alive. The gunship may have been a converted World War II transport, but it required a logistical system as modern and complex as any in the conflict, because Spooky didn't just fire bullets. It devoured them. A single mission could burn through 12,000 to 24,000 rounds of 7.62mm ammunition, sometimes more if the night turned desperate. Pallets of linked rounds had to be flown from depots to forward bases, sorted, inspected, and hand-loaded into belts by crews whose fingers were permanently stained with gunpowder and oil. One gunner later joked that if you cut him open, I'd bleed brass. Keeping a decades-old airframe battle-ready required equal effort. C-47s had sturdy bones, but Vietnam's heat, moisture, and red dust punished them relentlessly. Maintenance crews labored under floodlights until dawn, replacing worn barrels, patching shot-up fuselage skins, rewiring panels, or repairing landing gear scarred by rough jungle airstrips. Spare parts were cannibalized from scrap aircraft, improvised from local materials, or flown halfway across the world at urgent priority. Training was its own industrial miracle. Pilots had to master precise pylon turns, holding altitude, angle, and speed within razor-thin tolerances, so their gunners could carve perfect spirals of fire into the earth. Minigunners trained not just in marksmanship, but in weapons cooling cycles, jam clearing, and belt management. Flight engineers learned to balance engine stress against ammunition burn, fuel levels, and flare sequencing. Even the flares, those burning suns that turned night into blinding daylight, demanded constant resupply. Pallets of magnesium illuminants were hauled by forklift to the flight line, stacked inside the fuselage, and dropped one by one to keep the battlefield visible. The Viet Cong relied on porters, carrying rice and ammunition through the jungle. Spooky relied on an entire nation's industrial muscle, factories, ships, airlift networks, and thousands of workers who would never see the battlefield their labor helped protect. If the AC-47 was a dragon, then America's logistical system was the furnace that fed its fire. Long before historians tried to measure the AC-47's effectiveness in charts and kill ratios, the Viet Cong had already calculated its impact in a different currency, fear. The gunship didn't just kill, it announced itself. Even miles away, the drone of its twin radial engines carried through the jungle canopy, a deep, throbbing hum that seemed to vibrate in the bones. Villagers said they could feel it before they heard it. Viet Cong fighters described the sensation as a tightening in the stomach, a prickling of the skin, a pulse of dread spreading through a platoon before a single shot had been fired. They called it by many names: the dragon, the ghost, the night demon, and quietly among shaken survivors, the plane that eats men. Captured VC officers later admitted that entire units suffered from what American analysts labeled puff fever, a state of heightened anxiety triggered by the sound of overhead aircraft at night. Symptoms ranged from trembling hands and shallow breathing to sudden panicked retreats, even when Spooky wasn't present. The psychological toll grew so widespread that Viet Cong political cadres began issuing nightly pep talks, reminding fighters that the gunship was only a machine and not invincible. But on the ground, where men huddled in trenches while the sky rained fire, those words dissolved instantly. Among American and ARVN troops, the effect was the opposite. Spooky's arrival restored morale like nothing else in the war. Soldiers pinned down behind sandbags would shout and cheer when they heard the engines approach. One ARVN sergeant compared the sound to hearing your older brother coming to fight the bully who has been beating you all day. Another advisor recalled a wounded Montagnard fighter, barely conscious, whispering one request: "Is the dragon above us?" When told yes, he smiled and closed his eyes. Even civilians developed complex feelings toward the gunship. In some villages, Spooky was remembered as a savior, the protector that arrived just in time. In others, its presence meant terror: flares bursting overhead, rooftops torn apart by stray rounds, fields churned into raw earth. The war blurred those lines, as wars always do. But for the Viet Cong, the message was clear and unforgettable. The night, once their greatest weapon, now hid a monster that could see in the darkness and kill with sweeping, relentless precision. It was mechanical, merciless, and unmistakable. And once you heard its miniguns start to scream, you understood the truth. The dragon had found you. For all its terrifying power, the AC-47 was never invincible. It was a creation of two eras, a 1930s airframe carrying weapons of the 1960s, and the Viet Cong quickly learned that even dragons could bleed. The gunship's greatest strength, its slow, steady circling orbit, was also its greatest vulnerability. To deliver accurate fire, Spooky had to fly predictable patterns at relatively low altitude. Every guerrilla commander eventually understood what this meant. If you put enough guns beneath its orbit, you could hit it. On the Ho Chi Minh Trail, this weakness became painfully clear. The North Vietnamese, forewarned by shattered convoys and mauled supply columns, began massing heavy machine guns, 12.7mm DSHKs, 23mm cannons, and captured American 50 cals along likely gunship routes. When Spooky appeared, the sky erupted upward, angry fountains of green tracers reaching hungrily toward the circling aircraft. Inevitably, some struck home. One AC-47 operating near the Cambodian border took a burst of 12.7mm fire through its left wing, shredding fuel lines and forcing the crew to feather an engine while still returning fire. Another gunship over the Central Highlands suffered a catastrophic hit to its hydraulic system. The aircraft limped home with leaking fluid, shot-out panels, and a cockpit filled with smoke. The worst nights ended in fireballs. Several gunships were lost during the war, shot down while defending villages or striking at truck convoys in the darkest hours before dawn. Crews bailed out into hostile jungle, often wounded, sometimes hunted, before rescue teams could reach them. Others never made it out at all. For the men who flew Spooky, the mythic glow surrounding the aircraft never erased the cold truth that every mission meant circling in perfect view of dozens of unseen barrels aimed skyward. One surviving gunner later said it best. "We were the dragon, but dragons can be killed too." Even so, the losses did little to slow Spooky's operations. For every aircraft destroyed, replacements arrived. For every crew lost, another volunteered. Because the defenders on the ground still needed the dragon in the sky. And the war was far from over. By the end of its frontline service in Vietnam, the AC-47 Spooky had carved a place in military history far larger than anyone expected from a patched-up World War II transport. Its tally was not measured only in bodies or destroyed positions, but in something far more consequential: the collapse of an entire mode of warfare the Viet Cong once dominated. Across thousands of missions, Spooky responded to countless distress calls from isolated outposts, CIDG hamlets, Special Forces camps, ARVN positions, and American patrol bases strung across the South. Analysts later estimated that the AC-47's intervention saved hundreds of defensive positions from being overrun, many of them only minutes from collapse when the miniguns began to speak. Its confirmed effects included thousands of VC and NVA casualties, many inflicted during night assaults that would otherwise have succeeded. Dozens of large-scale attacks shattered before they reached friendly wire. Highway convoys protected, ambushes broken apart before they matured. Supply routes interdicted, particularly in Laos during early trail operations. Morale reversed. American and ARVN troops, who once dreaded the night, began to believe they could survive it. But the greatest legacy of Spooky was this: it stole the night away from the Viet Cong. Before the AC-47, darkness was the guerrillas' most potent weapon. Camps fell routinely between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. Patrols feared dusk more than enemy bullets. Night belonged to the VC because it masked their approach, shielded their numbers, and silenced American firepower. After Spooky entered the war, that calculus collapsed. The gunship's persistent orbit meant the VC had to disperse, slow down, dig deeper, and abandon the massed nighttime assaults that had defined their strategy. No longer could they rely on overwhelming surprise. No longer could they trust that darkness would hide them. Every flare in the sky might be followed by the dragon's roar. Even where Spooky wasn't physically present, its threat lingered. Entire attacks were called off simply because guerrilla scouts heard an aircraft circling in the distance. Units rerouted supply columns to avoid illumination zones. Commanders shifted doctrine from night dominance to night avoidance. The AC-47 did not win the Vietnam War, but it dramatically reshaped it, turning the Americans' weakest hours into some of their strongest, and proving that even a relic with the right idea behind it could change the rhythm of an entire conflict. Today, in the quiet halls of the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, an AC-47 Spooky sits under soft lighting, silent, polished, its olive-drab skin restored to wartime sheen. Visitors walk past it slowly, reading the placards, admiring the iconic round engines, and the blunt nose of a transport aircraft that once changed the fate of entire battles. Most see only a relic, Few grasp the weight of what it did. Step closer, and you'll notice the 3 dark openings cut into the fuselage. Ports where the miniguns once spat rivers of fire. Inside, the cargo bay is preserved much as it was. Ammunition racks lining the walls, mounting points still scarred from vibration, metal floor ribbed and worn from countless missions. The aircraft smells faintly of oil and old aluminum, as if waiting for its crew to return from a brief rest. Beside it, a small display case holds a simple sequence of objects: a link of 7.62mm rounds, spent brass casings, and a strip of grainy gun camera footage showing tracer fire carving through a black jungle night. The caption beneath it reads, AC-47 Spooky, first of the gunships, defender of the night. Every visitor sees something different. To an old American advisor, it may be the Guardian that saved his camp from being wiped out. To an ARVN veteran, it may be the Dragon whose arrival meant he would live to see dawn. To a former Viet Cong soldier, those few who visit such museums, it might stir memories of terror, the sudden illumination, the screaming miniguns, the jungle erupting under fire. One interrogation report from 1966 includes a simple line from a shaken VC survivor. "We laughed at that plane once. Then, one night, it opened its mouth and the world turned red." The laughter ended in seconds. The legend endured for decades. And there, in the museum's stillness, the old Goonie bird rests, no longer circling, no longer breathing fire, yet carrying the echoes of every night it reshaped, every village it saved, and every enemy who learned too late what the dragon in the sky truly meant.